There is a handbag that almost every woman in America has owned, wanted, or been given as a gift at some point in the last 30 years. You know the one, clean lines, a little structured, a small logo that said, quietly but unmistakably, I have taste. I have arrived. I am the kind of person who has her life together. It sat in department store windows and college dorm rooms and first job offices across the country. It was the bag you saved up for 3 months to buy. The bag your mum got you when you graduated. The bag that sat on the table at your first real dinner party and made you feel for the first time in your adult life like you actually belonged there. It wasn't Chanel. It wasn't Gucci. It didn't require a trust fund or a waiting list or a relationship with a personal shopper who called you by your first name. It was something better than all of that, actually. It was aspirational without being cruel about it. It was the fashion world saying for once, you are welcome here too. And the woman who created it, the woman who somehow figured out how to bottle the feeling of feminine ambition and sell it at a price point that felt achievable, died alone in her New York City apartment on the morning of June 5th, 2018, having not been meaningfully involved with her own brand for over a decade. Her name was Kate Spade. And the story of how she built one of the most beloved fashion brands in American history, what that cost her, what she lost along the way, and what the world lost when it lost her, is one of the most heartbreaking stories the fashion industry has ever produced. But here's what makes this story more than just sad. What makes it genuinely complicated, genuinely worth sitting with. The tragedy didn't start in 2018. It didn't start when the depression got bad. It didn't start when the marriage showed its cracks, or when the anxiety became unmanageable, or even when she sold the company to people who would eventually sell it again for $2.5 billion. It started the moment she decided to put her name on the bag. Because once you do that, once your name becomes a trademark, a logo, a globally recognized brand, you stop being fully a person and start being partly a product. And products can be bought and sold and repositioned and repackaged and sent out into the world without you, wearing your face, carrying your identity, answering to your name. Kate Spade spent the last decade of her life as a private citizen living in the shadow of a brand that had her name on it and nothing else of hers left inside it. That is the story. And it begins, as the best American stories do, in the middle of the country, in a city nobody from either coast would think to look. Kansas City Catherine Noor Brosnahan was born on December 24th, 1973, in Kansas City, Missouri. Christmas Eve, which, if you know anything about the woman she would eventually become, a woman obsessed with color and celebration and the art of making ordinary moments feel like occasions, feels almost too on the nose. Like the universe was already writing her character notes before she arrived. Kansas City in the early 1970s was solidly, almost aggressively, Middle America. It was the kind of place where the seasons mattered and the neighborhoods had personalities and people took genuine pride in being from somewhere real, somewhere that wasn't trying to be somewhere else. Not coastal, not glamorous, not particularly interested in fashion or design or the kind of aesthetic conversation that was happening in New York and Paris and Milan. Kate was the fourth of 6 children in a large Irish Catholic family. Her father, Frank, ran a road construction business, a practical, physical, entirely unglamorous occupation that required early mornings and hard work, and the kind of problem-solving that happens in the field rather than in a boardroom. Her mother, June, managed the household, which with 6 children was itself a full-time occupation requiring something close to military logistics. Growing up in that environment, Kate was by every account the funny one, the one who made the room louder just by walking into it. She had a gift for observation, for noticing the specific detail, the telling gesture, the exact quality of light in an afternoon that made it feel different from every other afternoon. She was theatrical without being showy, warm without being saccharine, the kind of kid that adults and other children both wanted around, which is a rarer combination than it sounds. She was also, quietly and persistently, restless, not unhappy, not ungrateful, just looking at Kansas City and sensing the way certain people do from a very young age, that the life she wanted was somewhere she hadn't been yet. She had no specific plan for what that life looked like, just a feeling, a pull. She studied journalism at Arizona State University in Tempe, which was, on its surface, a practical choice. Journalism was a real thing you could do with a degree. It had a career path and a professional structure and a way of explaining itself at family dinners. But what Kate was really doing at Arizona State, in the hours between classes and assignments, was immersing herself in aesthetics, fashion, the language of objects, the way things looked and what that communicated about the person who had chosen them. She had always been drawn to that. To the idea that what you chose to wear, to carry, to surround yourself with, was a kind of language, a way of telling the world who you were or who you intended to become. And it was at Arizona State, at a party somewhere in the mid-1980s, that she met a quiet, perceptive, genuinely funny guy from Missouri named Andy Spade. Andy was the younger brother of David Spade, who would go on to become one of the most recognizable faces on Saturday Night Live and in 1990s Hollywood. But Andy was no one sidekick, despite what the family tree might suggest. He was his own thing entirely, creative, thoughtful, with a particular gift for strategy and storytelling that would eventually make him one of the more quietly influential figures in American branding. More immediately, he was completely taken with Kate, and she with him. They started dating. The relationship had, from the beginning, the quality of a genuine creative partnership, rather than just a romance. They made each other think differently. They argued about ideas in the way that people do when they both care about ideas, not in the way people argue when they're just trying to win. They were, in the truest sense of the phrase, good for each other. After graduation, Kate did what ambitious young journalists do. She moved to New York. The idea Kate Brosnahan arrived in New York City in the late 1980s and got a job as an accessories editor at Mademoiselle magazine. Read that job title one more time and let it land. Accessories editor. It sounds, on paper, like the least consequential job in journalism. The person who writes captions about earrings while the real reporters cover real things. The fashion equivalent of being assigned to cover municipal water board meetings. It was not, in the traditional sense, a glamorous or powerful position, but for Kate, it was something closer to a research fellowship in exactly the subject she had been studying her whole life without knowing it. Every single day, her job was to handle handbags, to evaluate them, photograph them, write about them, understand them, to develop, through sheer volume of exposure, an almost cellular understanding of what made one bag feel special and another feel ordinary. What made a woman pick something up in a store and feel something, versus picking it up and putting it right back down. She handled bags from every major European house: Chanel, Gucci, Prada, Louis Vuitton, Hermes. She understood intimately what made them work. The proportion, the hardware, the way the leather aged, the way the logo functioned, not just as a mark of origin, but as a signal, a piece of social communication between the woman carrying the bag and everyone who saw her carry it. And the more she handled these bags, the more clearly she saw something that should have been obvious, but apparently wasn't to the people running the industry. There was a gap, a significant, yawning, genuinely inexplicable gap in the market. On one end, you had the European luxury houses, extraordinary craftsmanship, generations of heritage, prices that started at several months' rent and went up from there. Bags that were beautiful and aspirational, and for most of the women Kate knew, women her age, women who were building careers and building lives, women who were making real money for the first time, but not that kind of money, completely inaccessible, not just financially, but psychologically. There was something about those bags that said, "You have to have already arrived to carry this. The bag is, for after you've made it, it's a reward, not a companion on the journey." On the other end, you had the mass market. Practical bags, affordable bags, bags that did the job of carrying your things from place to place without communicating much beyond the fact that you needed something to carry your things in. In between, almost nothing. There was no bag for the young American woman who was on her way up, who was making $45,000 a year and living in a studio apartment in a great neighborhood and building something, genuinely building something, and wanted to carry a bag that reflected who she was, becoming rather than where she currently was. That woman existed in enormous numbers. She was everywhere. She was Kate's whole generation, and no one was making her a bag. Kate saw it so clearly it almost frustrated her. She would look at trade show after trade show, retail floor after retail floor, and the gap was just sitting there, open, waiting, almost begging to be filled. So in 1991, at 28 years old, she quit her job at Mademoiselle and decided to fill it herself. Now here is the point in the story where I need to stop and make something clear. Because there is a tendency when telling the stories of successful founders to make the decision to quit and start something sound like a natural, almost inevitable step. Like, of course she quit. Of course she started the company. She had a vision, she had the skills, the rest was just execution. That is not what actually happened. What actually happened is that Kate Brethernahan quit a stable, respectable job in one of the most competitive cities in the world, with no manufacturing relationships, no design school training, no startup capital, no industry connections, and no guarantee whatsoever that she was right. About any of this, she had a vision. She had Andy, who had by this point moved to New York and was working at an advertising agency, and believed in her completely. And she had a conviction, almost an irritating, irrational, completely unjustifiable conviction, that she was right about the gap in the market. She was right about the gap in the market. The two of them started sketching ideas at their kitchen table. Kate knew exactly, and I mean exactly, with the kind of precision that comes from years of handling other people's bags and knowing what she wished were different, what she wanted to make. Simple, clean, structured, American rather than European in its sensibility, optimistic rather than austere, bags that felt like they had a point of view without shouting about it. The early samples were made by hand, in a small space, on a tight budget. Kate would source fabric, work with small manufacturers, iterate on proportions, get samples made and tear them apart and start again. Andy handled the business side, pricing, distribution strategy, trade show logistics. And then there is the story about the first prototypes that tells you everything you need to know about both of them. Kate had gotten the exterior exactly right on the early samples. The shape, the proportion, the hardware, all of it was perfect. But the lining was wrong. It looked cheap. It undermined everything. And she didn't have the money to fix it in time for the first major trade show. So she took the lining out entirely. She removed it from the samples and pinned a small note inside each bag that said, essentially, "The lining is coming." She showed up at that trade show with bags that had no linings and a note promising linings that didn't exist yet. Buyers ordered them anyway. On the promise of a lining, that is how good the bag was. And that, in a single story, is how good Kate Spade was at selling a dream. The name before the company officially launched, Kate and Andy had to make a decision that seems from the outside, like a simple branding choice. It was not a simple branding choice. It was the decision that would, in ways neither of them could fully anticipate, define the rest of Kate's life. "What do you call the brand?" Andy suggested, combining their names. Kate and Andy were engaged by this point, about to be married. Kate Spade. It was clean, memorable, personal. It had a rhythm to it, a particular American quality, friendly but sophisticated, approachable but with backbone. Kate hesitated, not because she didn't love the name, but because she was a journalist by training and instinct, and she understood, at some level, the implications of what putting your name on something actually meant. If the brand was called Kate Spade the person and Kate Spade the brand would become, over time, the same entity. The brand's reputation would be her reputation. The brand's identity would be her identity, and vice versa, who she was would be inseparable from what the brand was. That kind of fusion can be a superpower when everything is going well. When the brand and the person are aligned, when the person is genuinely the living embodiment of the brand's values. The authenticity that comes from that alignment is almost impossible to manufacture or replicate. People don't just buy the product, they buy the person. But it is also a trap, because brands grow and get sold and get reshaped and get managed by committees and consultants and corporate parents. And the person whose name is on the door has no control over any of that. Once they've signed the papers, Kate understood this. Imperfectly, intuitively, not yet in the full concrete terms that would become clear later, but she understood it enough to hesitate. She went ahead with it anyway. In 1993, Kate Spade New York officially launched. The first collection was 6 styles, simple, structured silhouettes in matte nylon and canvas, clean rectangular shapes with minimal hardware, nothing fussy, nothing apologetic, nothing that felt like it was trying too hard or not hard enough. They debuted at a trade show and were almost completely ignored. They came back to New York, licked their wounds, kept going. Then Vogue noticed. A small placement, a single mention. A bag photographed in an editorial spread in the most read and most influential fashion magazine in the world. The kind of mention that, in the pre-internet era of fashion, was worth more than any advertising campaign they could have afforded, and everything changed. Not slowly, not gradually, almost overnight. Department stores wanted the bags. Women wanted the bags. The young, ambitious, newly employed women of mid-1990s. America looked at Kate Spade and felt something that the luxury European houses had never quite managed to make them feel. Seen. Not aspirationally seen, not you could be this someday seen, but actually, currently, right now seen. This bag was for them, not for the person they might become in 20 years. By 1996, Kate Spade had been named one of the top 10 emerging designers in America by the CFDA, the Council of Fashion Designers of America, the organization that represents the elite of American fashion. The same year, they won the CFDA's Perry Ellis Award for accessories. The fashion industry, in other words, was not just tolerating Kate Spade as a commercial phenomenon. It was recognizing her as a genuine creative one. By 1998, Kate Spade had a standalone retail store on Thompson Street in Soho, then another in Los Angeles, then one in Boston. The brand that had started with 6 bag styles and a missing lining was now a retail operation, a cultural touchstone, a shorthand for a particular kind of American femininity that hadn't quite had a name before Kate gave it one. And Kate, funny, warm, perceptive. Kansas City Kate, who had spotted a gap and filled it with determination and craft, and an almost stubborn refusal to accept that it couldn't be done, was the most interesting new figure in American fashion. She was also, without quite realizing it yet, beginning to disappear into her own logo. The boom, the late 1990s and early 2000s, were, by almost every measure, extraordinary years for Kate Spade, the brand. The bags were everywhere, carried by college students and celebrities and women in their 40s who had never thought of themselves as fashion people before, and suddenly, inexplicably were. Carried to job interviews and first dates and baby showers and work conferences. The Kate Spade bag had achieved something that most brands spend decades and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to achieve and never quite manage. It had become a cultural object, something that meant something beyond its function, a symbol. And the expansion that followed the bag's success was, in the context of the late 1990s American economy, almost dizzyingly fast. The brand moved into shoes, with the same clean architectural sensibility applied to heels and flats and boots that looked like they had opinions, into sunglasses, into stationery, which was, in retrospect, a deeply revealing category to add, because it said everything about what Kate Spade actually was. It wasn't just a fashion brand, it was a lifestyle proposition. It was saying, the woman who carries our bag also has particular views about her writing paper. She cares about the quality of the envelope. She thinks a thank you note is worth doing properly. Into fragrance, into home goods, into the kind of sprawling, fully realized lifestyle universe that only a handful of brands have ever successfully built. And that all of them, Ralph Lauren, Martha Stewart, Diane von Furstenberg, built around the genuine, coherent, personal vision of a single individual. Because that's what Kate Spade was, in its bones. Not a brand built by committee or by market research, but the actual personality of a woman from Kansas City, given form and color, and sold at accessible prices to the millions of women who recognized themselves in it. The Kate Spade woman lived in an apartment with interesting wallpaper. She threw small dinner parties and gave thoughtful gifts. She had opinions about flowers and strong opinions about fonts. She found the world genuinely delightful and wanted her environment to reflect that. Feminine without being fragile, elegant without being cold. A sense of humor about herself, the most underrated quality in any person or any brand. That woman was Kate, not an aspirational construct or a marketing persona. Kate Brosnahan Spade, the person, was the brand. They were not adjacent or aligned. They were identical. Andy had by this point left advertising entirely and was running the business side of the company full-time, which turned out to be exactly the right structure. Kate was the creative vision, the instinct, the eye, the personality. Andy was the execution engine, the strategy, the operations, the deals. They were, genuinely, a great team in the way that great teams are great, not because they were similar, but because they were precisely complementary. The company was, by the late 1990s, generating tens of millions of dollars annually. It had gone from a kitchen table operation to a genuine enterprise in less than a decade. And then, in 1999, Neiman Marcus Group came calling. They bought a 56% stake in Kate Spade for a reported $34 million, which made Kate and Andy suddenly and somewhat surreally wealthy in the way that people from Kansas City, who grew up in large Catholic families and worked hard and were careful, generally don't expect to become. The sale was rational. The sale made sense. The sale gave them capital and infrastructure and access to retail relationships that would have taken another decade to build independently. The sale also, quietly and irreversibly, changed the nature of what they were doing, because from that day forward, they were no longer just building something they believed in. They were also accountable to someone else's financial expectations, someone else's growth targets, someone else's version of what Kate Spade should be and where Kate Spade should go. That tension between the personal vision that had created the brand and the corporate logic that now partly owned it would define the next 8 years. The exit here is the question that the official history of Kate Spade almost never asks directly. Why did she actually leave? Not why did she sell the remaining stake? That's a financial transaction, and financial transactions have financial explanations. But why did Kate Brosnahan Spade, at 43 years old, walk away entirely from the company that bore her name? Why did the woman whose personality was literally there, brand, decide that she no longer wanted to be part of it? The story that was told publicly at the time was about motherhood. Kate and Andy had adopted a daughter, Frances Beatrix Spade, in 2005. She was a baby, and Kate wanted to be present for her, wanted to be a mother before she was a CEO, wanted to step back from the relentless, grinding, never really off pace of running a global fashion brand and be in the room when her daughter was learning to walk. And that was true. It was part of the truth. But the people who were close to Kate during those years tell a more complicated story, a story about a woman who had watched her creation grow beyond her in ways that felt both thrilling and quietly devastating. Who would pass Kate Spade stores? And by 2007 there were a lot of them in a lot of cities. And look at the window displays and feel a strange, uncomfortable distance from what was inside. Like looking at a photograph of yourself from a long time ago, taken on a day you barely remember, and trying to figure out how much of that person you still are. The brand had grown. Of course it had grown. That was the whole point. But growth, when it happens to something personal, has a way of sanding off the very edges that made it interesting in the first place. The idiosyncrasies, the specific jokes, the particular shade of a particular colour that meant something to one person, and now had to be approved by a committee. Under Neiman Marcus's ownership, Kate Spade had expanded aggressively. More stores, more categories, more product. The pressure of serving a major retail group's expectations, the quarterly targets, the growth projections, the licensing deals, had pushed the brand in directions that felt, to Kate, increasingly distant from the thing she had built. This is not a criticism of Neiman Marcus. This is simply what happens when a personal creative vision becomes a corporate asset. The vision serves the business, not the other way around. And for someone whose vision was genuinely personal, whose brand was, in the most literal sense, herself, that inversion is a particular kind of loss. In 2007, Kate and Andy sold their remaining stake to Liz Claiborne Inc. for approximately $59 million, bringing their total exit to around $93 million. They signed the papers, they walked out, and Kate Spade, the person, was no longer, in any formal sense, connected to Kate Spade, the brand. She was 43 years old, wealthy, with a beautiful daughter and a long marriage, and a life that looked, from the outside, like the ending of a very satisfying success story. What she did not have was a clear answer to the question now sitting in front of her. Who was she, if she wasn't Kate Spade? The quiet years, the years immediately following the sale, were, at least on the surface, defined by rest and travel and the rhythms of a life that finally had room to breathe. Kate and Andy took Frances and moved through the world at a pace that wasn't dictated by product launches or fashion calendars. They spent time in different cities. They explored. Kate, freed from the operational demands of running a company, threw herself into the things she had always loved: collecting, decorating, cooking, entertaining, all the domestic arts that had always been part of her sensibility but had never had enough time. She was, by accounts from people who saw her during this period, genuinely happy for a while. But Kate Spade, the brand, was still out there. It was still in every department store in America. It was still in the magazines. It was still being carried by the daughters of the women who had first carried it in the 1990s. And it was, under Liz Claiborne's ownership, being actively repositioned, made bigger, made more accessible, pushed into new categories and new price points and new markets, which was Liz Claiborne's right. They owned it, but Kate had to watch. She had to watch her name, her actual name, the name she was born with, the name on her driver's license, being applied to products she had no input on, in stores she had no say over, by people she had never met. She had to watch the brand she had built from a kitchen table and a paper bag and a missing lining become a $2 billion enterprise that no longer had anything of her in it. And then, in 2017, Liz Claiborne, by now renamed Kate Spade and Company, was acquired by Tapestry Inc., the parent company of Coach, for $2.4 billion. $2.4 billion. For context, Kate and Andy had sold their total stake for approximately $93 million. The brand they had created had subsequently been bought and grown and resold for 26 times that amount. This is not, in itself, unusual. This is how brand acquisition works. This is the math behind why people sell companies. The buyer takes the risk of growing it, and if they succeed, they capture the upside. But there is something uniquely disorienting about watching your name, your literal name, sell for $2.4 billion to a company you have no relationship with, for a brand that has none of your creative DNA left in it, while you are living in a New York apartment dealing with a depression that you cannot talk about publicly because you are afraid of what it will do to the brand's image. The brand that you haven't owned for a decade. The brand that no longer has anything to do with you, except your name. Because Kate, in those final years, was not well. She had been dealing with anxiety and depression for years, not quietly suffering in the way that the phrase dealing with sometimes implies a peaceful management, but genuinely, severely struggling. By Andy's own account, given publicly in the aftermath of her death, Kate had been in treatment. She had been working with doctors. She had been trying different medications, going through the slow, difficult, sometimes demoralizing process of finding a treatment that worked. But she had not been able to speak about it publicly. And the reason she had not been able to speak about it publicly was one of the most quietly devastating details of the whole story. She was afraid of what it would do to the brand. Not her brand, not a brand she owned or controlled or had any formal relationship with. The brand that had her name on it and was owned by Tapestry Inc. and had revenues of over $1 billion annually. She was suffering in silence to protect the reputation of a company she had sold 10 years earlier. Frances Valentine after, a few years of stepping back and breathing, Kate and Andy decided, eventually, to build something new. In 2016, they launched a brand called Frances Valentine, named with the kind of warm personal gesture that had always been Kate's signature after their daughter. Shoes, bags, accessories, the same fundamental aesthetic instinct that had driven the original Kate Spade, but perhaps even more personal, more refined, more purely the expression of what Kate had always loved about design, without the commercial pressures that had gradually reshaped the original brand. The brand was genuinely good. People who found it loved it. The design was warm and specific, and recognizably hers in a way that the later Kate Spade products, under multiple layers of corporate ownership, had stopped being. But it was a boutique operation in a market that Kate had essentially created, a market now crowded with competitors who had spent decades learning from what she had built. Coach, Tory Burch, Rebecca Minkoff, Michael Kors, all of them working in the space she had invented. Frances Valentine found its audience, but it never had the cultural lightning. In a bottle moment of 1993, Kate threw herself into it with genuine enthusiasm. She loved being back in the room where design decisions were made, where the color of a lining mattered and was worth arguing about. But the work, as much as she loved it, wasn't enough to hold off what was coming. Because underneath the new brand and the travel and the life that looked, from the outside, like it was going well, something was very wrong. And the specific and cruel nature of what was wrong was that Kate couldn't tell anyone about it, or at least didn't feel she could, because her name was still out there in the world, still on thousands of bags, still on the doors of hundreds of stores, and she believed, perhaps rightly, perhaps not, but she believed that any public acknowledgement of her mental health struggles would harm the brand that had her name on it, the brand that had absolutely nothing else of her in it anymore. June 5th, 2018. On the morning of June 5th, 2018, a housekeeper found Kate Spade in her apartment on Park Avenue. She had died by suicide. She was 55 years old. Her daughter Frances was 13. The note she left was addressed to Frances directly. Andy, in the statement he released in the days following her death, said the note was full of love for their daughter, that it was not a note of anger or despair toward anyone, that Kate had been ill and that she had been trying to get help, and that the illness had won. Andy was direct about the depression, about the treatment, about the medication adjustments, about the years of struggle that had been invisible to almost everyone who knew her or followed her or carried her bags. He spoke about her fear of stigma, about her unwillingness to seek more intensive help because she was worried about what a more public acknowledgement of her condition would mean for the brand that had been sold a tapestry for $2.4 billion the previous year. The fashion world stopped in a way that fashion worlds rarely stop. Tributes came from everywhere, from designers who had come up alongside her and been shaped by what she built, from editors who had championed her work in its earliest days, from women all over America, women of every age, every background, every income level, who had felt, at some point in their lives, that a Kate Spade bag had said something true and kind about who they were. That outpouring was real. It wasn't industry performance. It was grief, the specific grief that comes when someone who gave you something genuinely meaningful is suddenly permanently gone. And underneath the grief was something else. A reckoning with the question of how someone so publicly beloved could have been suffering so privately. How the woman whose name was on a billion-dollar brand could have been afraid to ask for help because of what it would do to that brand's image. The brand that bore her name and nothing else of hers. What was lost in the weeks and months after Kate's death? The fuller picture of her final years began to emerge in fragments. From Andy's statement, from interviews with people who had known her, from the careful, sad accounting that happens when a life ends too early and people try to make sense of the shape of it. What became clear was that the tragedy of Kate Spade was not simply the tragedy of a person struggling with mental illness, though it was certainly that, and that alone would be enough. It was the tragedy of a particular kind of entrapment. Kate Spade the brand was, by the time of Kate's death, one of the most recognizable fashion labels in the world. Hundreds of stores, annual revenue over $1 billion, a genuinely significant enterprise that by conventional measures represented an extraordinary success story. Kate Spade, the person, was a 55-year-old woman living with depression and anxiety who hadn't been creatively involved with the brand for over a decade, and who felt she couldn't speak about her struggles because of what it would do to a company she no longer had any relationship with. The brand had survived the person. The logo had outlasted the woman, a funny woman from Kansas City who loved color and charm and believed, with her entire being, that the world was better when things were beautiful, who had spotted a gap in a market and filled it with pure conviction and a note promising a lining that didn't exist yet, who had built something from nothing and given it to the world. She gave us the dream, and the dream, in the end, consumed her. The legacy here is what Kate Spade actually built. And I don't mean the brand, though the brand is significant. I mean the thing underneath the brand. She built a category. Before Kate Spade, the accessible luxury handbag, that specific tier of aspirational but reachable, fun but sophisticated, American in sensibility, and optimistic in spirit did not meaningfully exist. There were expensive European bags and cheap functional bags, and not much in between that had any personality. After Kate Spade, that space was the most competitive in retail. Coach repositioned itself entirely to compete in the lane she had defined. Tory Burch built a company now valued at billions in direct response to what Kate had proven was possible. Michael Kors found his commercial identity partly by studying what she had done. Marc Jacobs' accessible line owed her a debt. Every fashion brand that now sells a $300 bag to a 25-year-old is operating in a market that Kate Spade created. This is a legacy the industry doesn't always acknowledge directly, perhaps because doing so means acknowledging just how singular the original vision was. She also built something more personal than a market category, something harder to quantify and more lasting. She built an image of femininity, a vision of what a woman's life could look and feel like. That was, at its absolute core, joyful, not powerful in the armoured, shoulder-padded, I've beaten the men at their own game 1980s sense, not ironic and deconstructed and too cool to care in the 1990s downtown way, not minimalist and severe, and aspirationally austere, joyful, colourful, unapologetically delighted by the world. In a fashion industry that has always had a complicated relationship with happiness, that has sometimes treated grimness as a mark of seriousness, that has confused difficulty with depth, Kate Spade looked at all of it and asked a question that was far more radical than it sounded. What if things were just nice? What if a bag could make you happy? Not because it cost a month's salary, not because it signaled status, or exclusivity, or insider knowledge, but because it was genuinely, straightforwardly beautiful and fun, and made for a woman who deserved beautiful and fun things? That question was the entire brand, and the answer, repeated in tens of millions of purchases across 30 years, was yes. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The woman who asked the question deserved so much better than the answer she got from the world in return. And somewhere right now, in a department store in Kansas City, maybe, of all places, a young woman is picking up a Kate Spade bag for the first time. She doesn't know the whole story. She just knows it feels like something, like a promise, like the beginning of something good. She's not wrong about that. That was always what Kate was selling. If you, or someone you know, is struggling, please reach out. In the US, call or text 988. In the UK, the Samaritans are at 116 123. You are not alone.